Call to order this meeting of the Habitat and Water Quality Standing Advisory Committee. You have before you the draft agenda and the draft minutes. So let's handle those in that order, and then I'll defer to staff for a moment about some information that I think we all need to hear. So first, you have the draft agenda before you. If there are no objections, someone will make a motion to approve that agenda, please. And we're going to make a point of voting on these things, just, even though I know it seems kind of weird, but just to try to make sure that we're complying with legal requirements. Was there a motion?
I'll make a motion to.
Oh, go ahead.
Nope. I'll second it, right?
Yes,
There you go.
second.
Right.
Great. Any discussion? Yes.
This was just for the agenda, right?
Yeah, this is just for the agenda. And then once we have the agenda, then I'm going to go around.
I'll one back down.
Okay. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Aye. Aye. Any opposed? None. So let's take a moment and, just, if you don't mind, just introduce who you are. We do have a couple of people that are on remotely today too. And so we'll come back to that in a moment. So do you want to start? And go
Sure, I'll start. My name's David Glenn. I'm a meteorologist with the National Weather Service just up the street in Newport.
That's great. That's good.
Nathan Hall, I'm with University of North Carolina's Institute of Marine Sciences, right down the road here.
Sarah?
Sarah Gardner, charter boat captain, at-large commissioner.
And the joint co-chair with me. I'm Doug Rader. I'm retired from Environmental Defense Fund after close to 35 years of environmental science and sitting Marine Fisheries Commissioner.
And I'm Jesse Bissett. I'm the Marine Fisheries Commission liaison. I started in this position in February, so we actually haven't had a Habitat and Water Quality AC meeting since I've started. So this is my first one with y'all. It's nice to meet all of you and get to see you in person. I've talked to a few of you on the phone before, and I'm looking forward to working with y'all.
I'm Charlie Deaton. As of yesterday, I'm the Coastal Habitat Protection Supervisor. That was Ann Deaton's old position for those of you who knew her, but I've been at DMF for the past 2.5 years as the ship biologist. So looking forward to carrying on some of that work.
Welcome aboard.
Congrats. We were just having a conversation about who's going to take over that role at work the other day.
We're glad
We were hoping it was going to be you. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's exciting.
I'm Ben Curtis. I'm the oyster sanctuary biologist at DMF. I've been at DMF for 2.5 years as well. And like Jesse, this is my first Habitat BC workshop meeting.
He worked over at Whitehill Community College in the maritime programs, also a boat captain, got all the good boat stuff.
Mark Sonder, owner, operator, H2O captain, Echo Tour private boat excursions.
And just so everyone knows, Mark was actually here at the last meeting online, and we didn't get it, but as a visitor formally. And so that's going, when we get to the minutes in a moment, I'm going to make sure that you are counted as being present at the last meeting. Okay. So the agenda is adopted, and we'll get the minutes approved next. You have seen the draft minutes. Obviously, if you detected any minor typographical or things like that, feel free to work directly with staff, and we'll make sure that those get corrected before they are memorialized. But nonetheless, you have the draft. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
Well, I think I'm similar is that I didn't see myself counted in the last one either.
You got that, Jesse? Okay, we'll get that corrected.
Okay.
Are you willing to, since you got the floor, are you willing to move adoption with those two corrections?
Yep.
Great. I'll say second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, aye, please. Any opposed, no. Opposed, that motion carries. So Jesse, I'm going to turn to you for a moment just to clarify these matters related to attendance and meetings, and because going forward, we're going to need to comply with a little bit of a different approach to these things. Do you want to explain?
Yeah, thank you, Doug. So in August of this year, there was a Court of Appeals ruling that didn't have anything to do with fisheries or habitat. It was about a case that was in Anson County, and a sheriff vacated his position, and the county commissioners basically called an emergency meeting and appointed another sheriff in his spot. And there was ultimately a lawsuit against it. And the case was really about whether it was actually truly an emergency meeting. And if the public, technically for an official meeting of a public body, you have to give the public 48 hours public notice. Because this was an emergency meeting, they didn't do that. So that's what the case was ultimately about. But in the ruling, it said that for matters of a quorum, you have to be physically present to be counted as present. That virtual attendance for the purposes of meeting a quorum requirement, virtual attendance doesn't count. So in this particular instance, the commission members were virtual. So any discussion about whether or not this was a emergency meeting or not was moot because they didn't have a quorum and couldn't conduct business. Because of that, because that was a Court of Appeals ruling, that's currently the law of the land. It's likely that will eventually get overturned, but as of now, we have to operate with the understanding that for quorum purposes, which is the majority of the board plus one, so if there's 10 members, it would be 6 people in attendance for quorum to meet the quorum requirements, which we do have here tonight. And because that ruling says that you have to be physically present for a quorum, it calls into question whether or not any votes cast by virtual members actually count or not. So for the time being, given this ruling, we're asking that everybody come in person to the meetings if at all possible. And for anyone who can't come in person that does have to participate virtually, just so there's not any ambiguity in whether or not a vote should, if it did so happen that the virtual person cast a vote and that was a deciding vote on something, that wouldn't be a good situation to be in. So we're asking anybody that participates remotely to not vote. So that's how we're operating going forward. Like I say, it's likely that ruling will either be overturned eventually or something will be changed to the statutes that ruling is pulling from. But as of now, we're hoping everybody can meet in person, which I like seeing all y'all in person anyway. So great.
And so just to amplify that, if you're not able to attend and you have information that you want shared with the group, feel free to work with Charlie or Jesse or me, or for that matter, Sarah, and we'll make sure that information or points of view are represented. Feel free to participate electronically anyway, and if we're able mechanically to get comments back from you, from us into the discussion, that's great, but we will try to keep any votes that happen. There won't be any more tonight, but any votes that happen to people present in the room until we have another operating procedures guidance from the attorney. Sorry to drag you through that, but it's just important. We don't want surprises. Okay, fabulous. So Charlie, let me turn it to you if you don't mind. I know you all know that we're on a journey here related to submerged aquatic vegetation protection and conservation. And so we thought it was really important for us all to get fully up to speed on the entire management framework for this habitat, and for that matter, other related habitats that are under the purview of this advisory committee, standing advisory committee. And I just want to mention, I suspect that Charlie is going to do this anyway, but just to remind you that the Marine Fisheries Commission and also the Coastal Resources Commission and the Environmental Management Commission, all three adopting the current ruling version of the Coastal Habitat Protection Act, required by North Carolina law and adopted under the Marine Fisheries Reform Act way back when. Identified the conservation and effective management of SAB as a priority for all three commissions. Recognizing that no one of the commissions have under our direct purview all of the effects that might lead to negative or positive impacts on SAB habitat, whether they're the standing plant, our plants living there today or not. Places where submerged plants could live as the conditions exist now or could exist. And so that's a key part of this chip. The chip is coming up for revision beginning in 2025. I mean, that's when it ends, right?
It'll be 2026.
Yeah, okay. So that it's a perfect time, is what I'm getting at, for us to look at how far we've come. And I think that this information is going to be important for all. So Charlie, can I just turn it to you?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so that gave me a great intro there, so I'll just go ahead and hop into it. This is a presentation that I gave to the Marine Fisheries Commission at its August business meeting. You go ahead and go to the next slide. So apologies to commissioners over here because they've heard it up before. But for the rest of you, hopefully this is interesting. So this is the first of a few presentations that the MFC is going to be receiving from DMF's Habitat Enhancement staff, following the MFC's request at its May meeting for staff to develop some more comprehensive management options for SAB protection. But before getting into things, I want to provide a little background on how we got here. So historically, habitat protection from the MFC has been done in a fairly piecemeal form, targeting one habitat and one commercial gear at a time, typically coming out of FMPs. So what we're talking about today started with Amendment 2 to the Shrimp FMP, which was included an in-depth issue paper that proposed area closures for shrimp trawling to prevent physical disturbance of SAB habitat. With Amendment 2, the MFC implemented a closure in Bogue Sound and directed DMF to continue developing recommendations. Staff presented those recommendations to the MFC in February of this year and gathered input from the MFC's advisories committees, like this one in the spring. Staff got a lot of pushback on that proposal, as all of you will well remember. To summarize that input politely, members of the public noted that while protecting SAB habitat is important, this proposal would have singled out shrimpers and would have disproportionately impacted smaller boats. And if we were serious about SAB protection, we needed to be addressing the serious issue of declining water quality and ensuring that our proposals to the MFC are holistic and avoid singling out individual stakeholder groups. So listening to that feedback, staff proposed to the MFC in May that we step away from that shrimp trawl closure proposal and instead we develop options within the MFC's authority that address SAB habitat protection more broadly and holistically, which the MFC supported. So staff are currently working through documenting the extent of the MFC's authority on SAB protection and developing some potential options that are in line with the motion passed in that May meeting. And that motion, the key bit is up here on the screen. And staff aren't quite ready to bring that information to this committee yet. So today I'm going to go through some of the science of SAB habitat to provide some context for future action. Why SAB is important.
Charlie, could you take, are there any questions for Charlie about that adopted motion? I mean, just to be clear, you know, we're trying to put the options that on which the MFC has authority, you know, clearly in the front, but also look at how those potential actions dovetail with other actions needed that are not under the direct purview of this commission. That doesn't mean that the MFC, or for that matter, this advisory committee, couldn't make recommendations to those other commissions, but for the MFC, particularly in this adopted motion, we're trying to really look at the full array of opportunities that about which the MFC has authority, just so we can do our job. Do you have a question, Mark?
Yes, Doug. So as we found out from the last meeting, there was a humanitarian portion dealing with protecting the South. Would it be fair to those people, those companies, that they are most probably going to be a part of the array that you're speaking of now, with this holistic approach to inform them, if they weren't already feeling it back in January, that they may be affected from this in possibly a negative way, speaking economically for their company, for their families, and to make them aware to make, so they can make whatever future decisions or present decisions they may need to make for their families and or charter companies, et cetera, et cetera.
I think it's a good and fair point, and one that we should keep in mind, recognizing that a lot of the actions that would have those effects are likely not to be under our commission's purview, because we manage the fishing activities directly. And so keep it, if you don't mind holding on to it after we hear this. I think what it's going to have to do with is remembering that the water quality and other, including coastal development regulations that might cascade down, would end up going through a public input process under the aegis of one or more of those other commissions. And that doesn't put us off the hook. I think you're right about that, because the interactions are really important. But I think we're probably not that far down the road yet. Anyway, Charlie, why don't you go on, and then let's think about this as we move forward.
Yeah, for sure. So this presentation, we're just going through some background on why SAB is important, and a little high-level overview of how impacts to SAB have been managed in North Carolina by different commissions. And so at upcoming meetings, H&E staff are going to bring the MFC and this committee more information about what the MFC's legal authority is with SAB protection and some potential actions that can fall into that authority. So there's going to be more opportunities going forward to give input. This is not like a one shot, this is your last chance kind of thing.
Well, and presumably to have input into those other commissions' determinations as we go forward.
Yes, yeah. So for what we're talking about today, I'll go through this real quick. There's two main parts here. The first is I'm going to be talking about the ecology of SAB habitats, including the range of physical and water quality threats to SAB, along with how much we've lost over the past few decades. And in the second part, I'm going to talk about how the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan is coordinating protection for SAB habitats across 3 different commissions, that being the Environmental Management Commission that manages water quality, the Coastal Resources Commission that manages coastal development, and the Marine Fisheries Commission. And again, think of this is just part 1 of this conversation. We're going to go deeper into management actions in the future. So just to get everybody on the same page, I'm going to go through a few pictures of SAB. Some of you, this is going to be old news, but it'll get us all talking about the same thing here. So this and several of the following photos are taken from drone by Dr. Jesse Jarvis's lab at UNCW. These are SAB beds that are in the Topsail Sound area. That orange circled area roughly demarcates the SAB habitat. That's the dark patches just below the water here at low tide. It's common for SAB to be near other habitats like the salt marsh and the oyster reefs that you can see in this photo in green and gray colors. And it creates a mosaic of habitats that's really valuable to fish. And this is just zooming in at a closer angle. That's a roughly 18-foot skiff for scale. This is a very close-up view of an eelgrass bed at low tide. For those of you who fish seagrass beds, you're probably familiar with this view of the grass. This is a biologist surveying the SAB bed, and that's a 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter quadrat for scale. This is a widgeon grass bed up near Aurora. This is a pretty common site in our site in our state's low to mid salinity estuaries, especially in the summertime. While the eelgrass in the previous picture is only that close to the surface at low tide, the widgeon grass is able to grow higher to try to keep close to the surface of the water since it grows in those darker colored parts of the estuary. So it tends to be a little more noticeable. Going back to eelgrass, this is an underwater photo on an unusually clear day. This is another photo, a little more common condition with lots of scuzz. This is a mixed eelgrass and shoalgrass bed with some pinfish taking refuge in it. And so I'm going to quickly go through a little bit of SAB biology here. So when we're talking about submerged aquatic vegetation, we mean plants that are rooted into the sediment and continuously underwater, although sometimes extra low tides will expose certain species of SAB. So in North Carolina, we have 3 seagrass species that grow in high salinity waters and another 11 species that grow in low salinity waters. And we use, we being the DMF Habitat Enhancement section anyway, use the 10 parts per thousand salinity as an approximate divider between high and low salinity SAB. And for a quick note on terminology, you'll hear me say SAB habitat, SAB beds, and seagrass meadows interchangeably throughout this. And for the purposes of this presentation, those are all the same thing. SAB does not include algae like sea lettuce or codium, which don't root into the sediment, though you'll frequently see them together, especially in the wintertime. And it also doesn't include marsh grasses like Spartina, which are exclusively intertidal and get managed as coastal wetlands. So this is a video that Joel Fodry and Tony Rodriguez and some of their students at UNC's Institute of Marine Sciences produced. Up in the top right, you've got the track of a red drum that was tagged moving around an SAB bed in Middlemarsh. And at the bottom, you have the recreated fisheye view where they followed along that track with a kayak. So this is what the fish is seen as it forages around in the SAB. So I think we're probably looping at this point. Yeah, go ahead and move on. So all state managed species except for oysters have been documented to use SAB as habitat, as of many interjurisdictionally managed species. SAB fills several ecological roles as a fish habitat for different species, which includes refuge area, spawning for spotted sea trout and bay scallops, nursery habitat, foraging grounds like you saw in the last video, and movement corridors. And my main takeaway here is really just that SAB is important in a lot of different ways for a lot of different species that are important both recreationally and commercially. And if you're interested in the ways that different fish use the SAB habitat, we have this information summarized in 2021 CHIP. And I would be happy to follow up with anybody if you have any questions about specific species or interactions. And this is, again, borrowed from Joel Fodry at UNC. SAB is home to a lot more than just those managed species. It's home to a lot of small fish, crustacean, and shellfish species, and it's home to a disproportionate share of the base of the food chain. So this is a selection of the nearly 200 species of fish that UNC IMS has caught during their ongoing seagrass trawl survey. And those surveys are only in the high salinity seagrass beds. So there are certainly more fish that use SAB as habitat that aren't captured in this survey. And while SAB habitat isn't quite as well studied as wetlands, we still have a really solid base of literature to draw on that emphasizes how important it is for fisheries. And the points on this slide are all from studies conducted in North Carolina. Researchers have found that our seagrasses support 10 times more fish than unvegetated mudflats, 2 to 3 more times than marsh creeks, and that fishery production from our high salinity habitats alone contributes to more than 10% of the economic value of our commercial fisheries. Putting our beds into a global context, comparative studies have found that our seagrass meadows have the highest prey consumption rates in the entire Northern Hemisphere, which means that our SAB has really incredible value for supporting foraging fish. And beyond offering excellent fish habitat, there's a lot of research that supports other ecosystem services provided by seagrass habitats, including water quality enhancement, sediment stabilization, and carbon sequestration, among others. So as valuable as it is as a habitat, SAB can be pretty finicky about when and where exactly it grows. So I'm going to go over some basic requirements for SAB growth and then get into how it's distributed across the state. There's two primary requirements for SAB growth, the first of which is light availability. Because they're plants, SAB needs to have enough light to make it through the water column to allow them to photosynthesize. So to speak in very general terms, and I'm rounding here, that light requirement is in the ballpark of 15 to 25% of the light that hits the surface of the water column. And how much of it makes it through is governed by how clear the water is and how deep it is. With the water clarity of North Carolina's estuaries, most SAB grows in approximately 6 feet of water. It does grow deeper in 7 to 8 foot of water in areas with clearer water, but those deeper beds are the most vulnerable to being lost. Some species have evolved a tolerance for lower light in the low salinity regions, like the woodland grass I showed you earlier. It grows all the way to the surface of the water column, but those species are still rarely growing in much more than 6 feet of water.
Is that higher in low tide, or is it just generalized?
Just generally speaking.
Okay.
Yeah. The other primary requirement for SAB growth is some degree of physical stability. The exact components of that physical stability are kind of site specific, but they include a combination of lower wave energy, shallow depth, and stable sediments. Essentially a lack of regular physical disturbance. SAB does have some ability to recover from physical disturbance, but that resilience to disturbance decreases in low light situations or when that physical disturbance is repeated regularly. And salinity and temperature are also key requirements of individual SAB species. SAB can grow in pretty much all of North Carolina's waters that have the light availability and physical stability, but temperature and salinity will affect which species will grow and at what times of the year. And those conditions change pretty dramatically throughout the year. And from year to year, which means that in some places, especially the small and patchy SAB beds, SAB will disappear for a few months and then come back. And in especially suboptimal growing conditions, year-to-year variability means that the seagrass may regularly disappear or dramatically thin out for a year or two before it comes back. And this is an issue that we expect climate change to seriously exacerbate in the coming years. And we're already kind of starting to see some species of SAB transition as our waters warm. So to give a little description of where in North Carolina we do have SAB, the map on the right shows where SAB has been mapped across the state. For our estuaries, we have reliable maps of SAB extent based on aerial imagery that date back to 1981. And in the 2021 CHIP, DMF staff compiled and updated this map with all the available reliable SAB surveys, which represents a composite or a mosaic of 18 different surveys conducted between 1981 and 2021. So we have approximately 196,000 acres of SAB habitat that's been mapped statewide. And that's likely an underestimate given the difficulty of obtaining quality aerial imagery of the SAB, especially in the darker waters of the lower salinity regions. As I mentioned earlier, the extent of SAB is variable from year to year as it responds quickly to annual fluctuations in environmental conditions, which means that if an area has supported SAB habitat in the past, it should generally still be able to support it today, as long as water clarity and physical suitability have not permanently changed. And so while there's some areas that previously supported SAB that may have become too deep, like dredged channels or areas where inlet shoals have shifted, the bulk of the areas mapped here either represent present SAB habitat or areas that we see as targets for SAB restoration. So this is a zoomed in view of that mosaic in the Cape Lookout and Harkers Island area. And again, this represents all the SAB that's been mapped between 1981 and 2021 in this area. You'll notice that most of it's on the backside of the banks here. The majority of our state's SAB habitat is on that back barrier shelf. from Cape Lookout north through Currituck. And then this map is of what we have in the most recent SAB surveys, which you'll notice is much smaller than what was vegetated since 1981. These surveys were compiled 2019, 2020 by APNA. And you'll notice that a lot of that loss is along the back barrier shelf on the deeper part of the that shelf. So this is just overlaying those two, where you can see orange now is area that has been vegetated in the past and is no longer green as of the most recent survey was vegetated. So going into a little more detail about SAB loss in the state, I'm gonna go, let's see, for the high salinity region, and there's a lot of caveats when it comes to talking about the amount of SAB we've lost, so I'm only gonna go over it at a pretty high level here. Starting with high salinity, APNEP compared their first two statewide surveys from 2007 and 2013 and found an average loss of roughly 1% per year, though it was higher in some areas. I've been working on an analysis of some of our maps and APNEP's data, and we're seeing kind of the same thing, which is a 1% loss over that, 1% loss per year over that 40-year period. APNEP has also looked at loss in the SAB in the low salinity region, and the methods of that analysis are a little different. I'm not going to go into that, so it's not fully comparable, but it's the same ballpark that they're seeing of roughly 1% loss per year over a 30-year time frame. So 1% loss per year may not sound like a lot, but that means that we've already lost 40% of the known SAB habitat that we've mapped since reliable mapping began. And if it continues, we will have exceeded 50% loss within a decade. And to be a little more depressing, we aren't just losing extent of beds, we're losing quality of our SAB beds too. So APNEP in their mapping notes if SAB is thick and continuous or if it's thin and patchy. And so from that analysis they did comparing 2007 and 2013 surveys, you'll notice in these pictures that a lot of the continuous SAB habitat, which is in green, has transitioned to patchy, which is in yellow. And that's particularly clustered on the deeper edge of these seagrass beds towards Pamlico Sound. And that patchiness is bad, not only because it can reduce fisheries production from the habitat, but once patchiness and fragmentation get bad enough, the seagrass no longer stabilizes the sediment very well, and that resuspended sediment can result in even more loss of SAB. And so getting at the causes a little bit, the South Atlantic Council's 2014 SAB policy is kind of the best describer of the major threats to SAB. And you'll notice that this lines up pretty well with the primary requirements for SAB growth, like I presented them here. So the first is light limitation. So that's going to be connected to runoff from land, either through particles and tannic water in the runoff or phytoplankton growth from the nutrients. And it can also be connected to resuspension of sediments on the bottom from waves, boats, and other bottom disturbances. The other major threat category that policy identifies is mechanical damage, which can be from propeller damage, bottom disturbing fishing gear, and dredging and filling. These are all impacts that are worsened when they occur more frequently or when water quality is also degraded. And that policy is now 10 years old, and it included climate change as kind of a footnote to those other human-caused impacts. But the science of the impacts of climate change has advanced dramatically in those 10 years. So just to briefly highlight some research on climate change impacts on SAB from here in North Carolina, we have good evidence that climate change is already bringing more rain and bigger tropical storms to our state, which drives more runoff to our estuaries. And those high rainfall storm events can actually double the annual nutrient delivery to our estuaries, which can lead to increased phytoplankton growth that can last for weeks and have serious negative impacts by shading out the SAB. Further, with rising water temperatures, eelgrass, which is the foundation species of our high salinity seagrass beds, is expected to experience dramatic declines over the coming decades. And already the number of summer days that get hot enough to cause stress and mortality to the eelgrass have nearly doubled since the 1960s, going from 85 hot, stressful days per year to 156. And I'll note that while we don't have published research in North Carolina on how sea level rise is going to affect SAV, in other states with comparable estuaries, there's research that suggests that sea level rise is already contributing to the loss of that deeper water SAV. So rounding into management here, yeah, go ahead.
What would constitute high temperature water?
The mark that they use is 30 degrees Celsius, which is off the top of my head, somewhere in the mid 80s.
Well, while somebody's calculating that, I have another question for you
Yeah,
too.
go for
So I'm a meteorologist, right? So when I looked at all those images and graphics, I immediately thought about storms that impacted the area. So obviously, when we have heavy rainfall systems like Matthew and Florence, they're going to produce a lot of persistent runoff that will impact water clarity. But what I also thought about, especially when you showed the one between 2007 and 2014 or something like that, there were two significant storms that went right across the Pamlico, we had Irene and Arthur. Do individual storms with the sort of changing of the environment, shifting sands, and is that a big impact, or is it more about the water clarity side?
So off the top of my head, I'm not aware of studies looking at kind of long-term impacts from individual storms. I haven't been out in the field after some of the smaller storms, the tropical storms. What I've noticed is a lot of the time there will be, if you think of seagrass bed, if it's the size of this room, there's some holes that are the size of the chairs, some holes that are the size of the table, and you'll have so much water flow that those get dug out and deepen and bigger. And there's some ability for the SAV to come in and recover and grow back into those. But I don't know off the top of my head studies, and they may exist and I just can't quote them to you. But it's certainly a consideration.
Yeah, I just wondered if there are storms.
Hurricane Dorian in the northern part of Core Banks and in what used to be a big flood tidal delta inside of Oak Brook Inlet, used to be a big expanse of seagrass. Dorian wiped it out. I don't know if it's come back, but I know from the satellite images before Dorian, it was there. After Dorian, it was gone. And they come back. That was 2019.
I haven't been back to, I've been out in the field, but I haven't seen satellite imagery, but
Okay.
I can go into some of APNEP's long-term stations out there for 2022, 23, one of those years. We would go around and think, why are they sending us here? This is a 18-foot deep hole. This is just a bare sand flat. So there definitely some long-standing impacts, especially in the areas that were highly disturbed.
Well, I can imagine several different scales of impacts where you've got direct scouring and, for that matter, bathymetry modification that can be really significant. Well, for that matter, if we get Roanoke Inlet blows again, all changes are off, cascading from salinity and all that kind of stuff. But then in addition, as you were saying, you've got all these big pulses of fresh water, of nutrients, especially nitrogen that's mobilized that way, but also sediments, fine organics and sediments that can radically shift the sedimentary environment in some of those places. So how long does that persist? It depends, right, on what the disturbance regimen is. And I don't know I'd like to know, because it does, if we're postulating, I think everyone agrees that we're postulating that we'll get more bigger storms, then those more severe impacts will be more frequent. And to the extent that there are long-lived effects, those are things we need to be able to look at. And it makes me wonder, particularly about some of the fragmentation issues and how those then interact. So if you've got fragmented seagrass beds that are less resistant to energy coming from storm events, more likely to be subjected to large-scale disturbance as a result. And I can imagine that this is what I should have thought, like a vulnerability index of some sort, and it might be way higher. I'm just guessing. What do you think? I'm just guessing.
I could, just speaking from being on the water, that we see prolonged periods of stained water after some of these events. And I know after Dennis and Floyd, we had literally 6 months of outgoing tide on top with water quality severely affected during that time. And we noticed in the northern end of the Outer Banks that our grasses were affected by that. So it's definitely,
And I mean, it gets into all kinds of ecological cascades that I suspect we don't understand, right? There were at least allegations that nitrogen can be directly toxic to some species of seagrasses. Is that true? I don't know. Yeah, that's sort of old, who knows? But indirectly, it's really a different thing where you end up with, to the extent that very large amounts of nitrogen particularly is mobilized throughout the basin and then is available, can get regenerated by all kinds of activity, then you end up with algal blooms coming and going more frequently, also interdicting light. And so, one of the ironies is that a lot of the sedimentation and erosion control programs that were put in place in North Carolina did a good job of cleaning up muddy water coming from from agricultural and development sources, not necessarily then combined with parallel reductions in nitrogen loading, even though some of they're basin-wide targets, but not necessarily localized targets. So it's a real trade-off between what it is that's interdicting light. Is it mud or is it algal blooms, or it's the trade-off between those is important. And it does seem like the species competence to evolve, to continue to persist in those different regimes gets really even more complicated.
Yeah, things are gonna get a lot more complicated as climate change continues. Like, it's not gonna be a simple solution anywhere.
I don't want to show my hand, but I mean, well, maybe I do. So I think the biggest flaw in the previous approach, and that's not to cast aspersions on the people that brought it to us at all, was the fact that we felt like we were constrained to deal with these threats piecemeal, as Charlie said, and not just piecemeal within the authority of a governance entity, but also piecemeal through the lens of a given fishery management plan, one or another. And so therefore, under the aegis of the shrimp fishery management plan amendment, we were looking at regulating shrimping under that plan, as opposed to another approach that I think we should think about later, which has to do with delineating those areas that we believe are high quality and vulnerable to all kinds, and which can then cascade into the authority of those other commissions. And I'll put the example on the table so as Charlie was forwarding you to be thinking about it. So the Marine Fisheries Commission was front and center in scientifically identifying using data, and then delineating and designating formally by regulation both primary and secondary, and then special nursery areas throughout the coast of North Carolina, identifying the value and why they were important and the kinds of things that then would threaten those. And then that cascaded into the adoption of specific water quality standards and then specific development restrictions under the aegis of the Marine Fisheries, of the Environmental Management Commission, and then the Coastal Resources Commission. If those are all tied, if you look at those maps, those are all tied back to the initial step, identifying what needed to be protected against all kinds of threats. So I think the staff has taken us a long way towards delineating those areas. And now if we can move forward with taking a multi-species, multifactorial approach, I think we'll be in better shape. So I'm sorry about that.
Oh, good, Charlie. Sets me up well here because we're going to start talking about management by different commissions. Speak a little bit to how we've managed SAB to manage those impacts so far. Most of our efforts have come through the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, which is a DEQ plan led by DMF and mandated by the 1997 Fisheries Reform Act, which I'm sure is a sentence most of you have heard at least 100 times now. The MFC, the CRC, and the EMC all have to approve the CHIP, so I'm going to speak a little bit to what each of those commissions has done. So starting with the Environmental Management Commission, the EMC oversees the Division of Water Resources among some other DEQ divisions, but DWR is the important one here, and they govern impacts to water quality across the state. One of the EMC's key duties is designating water quality standards, which set limits on the amount of pollution allowed in our waterways. The EMC's chlorophyll and turbidity standards offer some protection to SAB from two major sources of light limitation, though both have proven to be insufficient thus far. And areas with mapped SAB have been designated by the EMC as outstanding resource waters, which is a higher classification than most of North Carolina's surface waters and subjects them to additional requirements such as more stringent stormwater standards for new developments that are built in. And I'm going to go into a little bit more depth here because water quality improvement for SAB was a really hot topic of discussion at previous meetings when we were talking trawling restrictions. So DWR staff have led the Nutrient Criteria Development Plan, or NCDP, with collaboration from other DEQ divisions, including DMF's habitat staff. Because the EMC's current chlorophyll and turbidity standards aren't enough to protect SAB from light limitation, the 2021 CHIP placed a really big emphasis on developing new standards and updating current efficient standards to improve water quality to protect and restore SAB. To address that, the NCDP team has developed a water clarity standard because poor water clarity on the whole is what prevents light from reaching the SAB beds. And DWR staff are beginning the process of bringing that proposed clarity standard to the EMC sometime in 2025. There are a lot of potential pitfalls along the way, but if the approval process goes smoothly, it'll take about a year. From there, it would take until the 2030 biennial update to the 303D list to have enough data to assess water bodies as impaired for clarity. And an impairment listing on the 303D list triggers the need to develop a total maximum daily load, or TMDL, or another approved alternative for restoration. Following that,
I think you should probably pause there and make sure everybody's tracking that.
Yeah. This is
How any water quality standard gets implemented is in many cases retrospective. In other words, if you can't demonstrate that a standard is going to be violated by some new development activity that doesn't yet exist, which you can always say it'll make it worse, but it's very hard to say that a numeric standard would be violated or would be violated more or less often through time. Then the way you deal with it is to remediate it when evidence becomes to hand that that standard is being violated. But if the standard is designated to be violated, most of the certainly enough to be designated that way, then those waters are deemed to be impaired. They're listed under the 303D list, which is that's section 303D of the Clean Water Act, federal designation that's implemented in North Carolina by North Carolina's rules. And that in turn then requires that that water quality problem be remediated by the implementation of the total maximum daily load, or TMDL, total maximum daily load, TMDL, that then requires planning at the watershed scale to remediate the sources of those things all the way back. It's a complicated cascade of things, but at the end of the day, that the rubber hits the road, and it does require that land use planning and other changes, even differences in engineering, be implemented within those basins to those places where water quality standards are being violated. So it seems like a long road, and I guess it is. But that's the way things get done. Yeah. If I'm wrong about something, tell me.
No, that's my understanding.
That's the way I remember. But
yeah,
see, that's out of way.
Right. Yeah, and part of the hang up is they need a certain amount of data to conclude an assessment that yes, this is impaired, and the expectations that a lot of our waterways will be impaired for clarity if this passes. So even though the expectation is that it's obvious, they have to collect the data in a certain way for a certain amount of time before they can put it on the list, which is, it is what it is. So once you have that restoration plan or TMDL in place, then you can start actually doing the on the ground restoration work where you're changing those land use plans, changing permits, looking at different ways to reduce nutrient loading, or erosion if it's a sedimentation issue. So because of the long process, we're looking at roughly a decade before we start to see potential improvements to water clarity from this process. And that's if the EMC approves this standard. And I don't think I mentioned this, but the CHIP proposed a new clarity standard and changes to the potential changes to chlorophyll standard and potential nutrient standards down the line. The current thinking from DWR is that those latter steps are probably not going to happen. They're probably not palatable to the EMC. And the thought then being that if we can get the clarity standard passed, that we would be able to remedy those issues for the water bodies where clarity is assessed as impaired, because then you would go back and say, okay, so why is clarity impaired? Is it too much sediment? Is it too much runoff? Is it nutrients? And then kind of backtrack that way to a restoration plan.
Just for what it's worth, the other pathway there is, in addition to SAV habitat, then cascading as an outstanding resource water that brings a pre-existing set of additional standards. There's not really any reason that another water quality classification couldn't be adopted, even as a subcategory of ORW or somewhere else that might tie back to something that our commission would do. We might designate SAV habitat by regulation, not by what came to us before was an action by the director, by proclamation, without public input to do things that were important within her purview and our purview, but actually going through a rulemaking process to designate SAV habitats or SAV habitat waters or something we might call like that, then could directly adopt more stringent control measures within those waters or adjacent areas that are tributary to those waters. So, and to me, that's a shorter term, sort of non-remedial approach, although the two things would dovetail. So I don't know if we can gin that up or not, but that's I think we ought to think about it.
Right, because we're still losing that 1% a year. So by the time we start to see any on the ground improvement from this, we will have already crossed that. We will have lost more than 50%,
10 or
of what we had
12%.
found. Yeah. And that's if losses don't accelerate.
Can I make a couple I was heavily involved in this criteria development program, and there's different ways to skin the cat. One way is the way they've chosen, which is the clarity standard. And part of me understands why they went this way and part of me doesn't, because they could have just changed the things that we control, which is chlorophyll and turbidity. They could change the standard for those for SAV habitat based on the old, our mosaic maps. That decision was, I don't know, to me, that would have been a better way to go. The problem is the way it's currently written, you're going to have huge chunks of estuarine waters that are going to be on the 3D list unless there's some kind of natural cause exemption, because the water is just coffee up in like Albemarle Sound. The water is dark. It's never going to meet the clarity standard. If you took out all the phytoplankton and all of the sediment in the water, never going to pass the current clarity standard. So yeah, anyway,
I think
that I'm not surprised that there's continuing discussions about the clarity standard approach. To me, it's actually a positive thing that it hasn't been completely signed up on yet, because I think there's probably better ways to go about it. And I'm happy to say it because it'll be in the minutes.
Yeah, and so
And I've said it in
DWR
the
is assembling
criteria
the-
development process several times too. So
Yeah, there's
They're not
simply
gonna
a
surprise.
criteria implementation committee to get feedback on it. in the
yeah, and I'm
next
on that.
few-
So
Oh, you are on that. Okay,
Yeah, I'm on
perfect. So
that.
you'll
So
have
I'll be
opportunities
giving
to-
that committee.
Well, we'll have plenty of
Excellent.
chance to get back into it,
Yeah.
but for what it's worth, to me, those are not exclusive. In other words, right now, the problem is there's nothing to tie there's nothing that's been adopted by rule to which you could tie the different standards. And so, you know, because not all ORWs would be appropriate, right? There's ORWs in the mountains. It's separate.
Right.
And so if
And
we.
there are special chlorophyll standards for trout streams.
Right, yeah, right, and they're different.
And turbidity.
And they're different.
Yeah.
Than, so, but if we think about moving forward with a designation, a formal place-based designation for, I don't want to anticipate what the right answer is. Not just a cascade of SAB to B ORWs, but actually a category of outstanding resource waters that are called and mapped as SAB habitat. So it's a delineation that's subject to input, science and public input and adoption under the rules. Then there's no reason in the world that you couldn't tie a different chlorophyll standard, turbidity standard, and for that matter, clarity standard, just to those waters. And that doesn't stop you from dealing with things that are indirectly delivered to those places, because that's all standards work that way. You know, wherever the causal relationships are induced, you can go back and recapture those effects. But if we could delineate it, then you could step in and put in place a more appropriately more restrictive standard for those other two things. And the question is clarity then an additional needed piece or not? So I think it's we can, as this process goes forward, we can take all this in better advisement.
Yep, I agree with that.
Yeah, like Nathan said, a lot of different ways to do it. So, gonna go quickly through the CRC and MFC, so I don't need too much of Bennett's time here. But the CRC is responsible for rules and policies for coastal development, and their role with SAB protection falls under permitting coastal development in terms of. So they have a policy that they apply that development has to avoid significant adverse impacts to SAB habitat, and they use the MFC's definition and rule of SAB habitat to guide their permitting. And additionally, DMF's permit reviewers under our habitat enhancement section review all the major permit applications that DCM receives and vet them for impacts to SAB and other habitats. And that policy can be applied in a broad sense, such as denying all new dredging through SAB, and also in more specific and nuanced ways that, like ensuring that if a permit for a dock falls outside of the generally protective standards that qualify it for a general permit, it'll get elevated to a major permit, which allows DMF's permit review staff to assess it and recommend modifications to prevent negative impacts to habitats like SAB. So that could be relocating it away from beds, that could be changing the height of a boat lift, that sort of thing. And saving the best for last here, the MFC has traditionally managed physical impacts to SAB beds through individual commercial fishing gear restrictions like shrimp, trawl, and shellfish dredge area restrictions, along with nursery area designations, shellfish rake size and weight limits. And this has been a piecemeal approach that's resulted in kind of a patchwork framework for protecting SAB from physical disturbance here. The areas highlighted on this map are a wide range of different rules, some of which only restrict a single gear and some of which only apply for part of the year. Further, some of those designations weren't even designed specifically with SAB protection in mind, like nursery area protections, which were designed more broadly. But they provide different levels of protection from bottom disturbing gear and from navigational dredging. And I teased this a little bit when I was discussing the CRC, but the MFC also put into rule a definition of SAB habitat, which is what the CRC relies on, and what the EMC may refer to if they choose to implement that proposed clarity standard. So having that rule has been incredibly important for protecting SAB habitat. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the goal with where we're going is to take a more comprehensive approach to protecting SAB in the state rather than the piecemeal management we've talked about right here. So while we don't have management proposals coming at you today, as we develop those, and this advisory committee is going to have an opportunity to comment on those. we're keeping an eye towards ensuring that the MFC's protection against physical disturbance of SAV beds are more holistic and integrated and not just singling out one user group or another. So quickly going through the takeaways here, our SAV habitat plays a major role in our state's fisheries. We're losing SAV and we're likely to lose it faster. The EMC oversees water quality protection and is going to consider a clarity standard next year, though we're looking at a minimum of 10 years before we start to see any improvements from that rule if it's approved. The CRC has authority over in-water development impacts like dredging and docks. The MFC has so far managed physical impacts with fishing gear restrictions. And because we continue to lose SAV, action remains urgent. And so with that, I will take any questions that you guys have.
That's great, Charlie. Thanks. Just a couple of observations. Number one is, remember one of the first slides you saw identified propellers from watercraft as a major source. Right now, it's not clear to me who would have the authority, since Marine Fisheries Commission does not, in terms of managing non-fishing activities on the water. Does the Wildlife Commission, outside of joint waters and inland waters? Who knows? I mean, so if we wanted to do something, let's say within designated SAV habitats related to boat propellers, what approaches might be available?
Right,
Yeah,
and so
thoughts
that is
about
a conversation that staff are having, and we don't have, I don't know that we're ready quite yet.
I'm not putting you on the spot.
But we're going back and forth with the lawyers and figuring out exactly where the MFC's jurisdiction ends and where we're gonna have to go to other commissions.
Well, it may turn out that no commission, actually. I mean, maybe the CRC has a,
Yeah, that's exactly as Charlie said, that's the step we're at currently, so that we can make sure we have a plan that develops within those powers. And then long-term, look at what would require coordination with other agencies outside of the three that we're coordinating with. So, if it was ag related, you'd have to work with ag. If it was pesticide, you have to work with the pesticide board. Different strategies that can be longer term, but we want to make sure that legally we understand before we move forward. So that's to at least alleviate the delay.
I think that's the right way to think about it, and just to make sure it's on the table and identify places for the existing governance structure, the allocation by the General Assembly, and for that matter, the National Congress and the Constitution, for what people can and can't do today doesn't mean that's the limits for tomorrow. So if there are important threats that we can't moderate under the existing governance structure, we need to identify those, not just throw up our hands and think about what might be necessary. I'll just mention one more of those externalities is that, and Charlie mentioned the South Atlantic Councils. So there are lots and lots of federal activities that have direct and indirect effects on these same waters and these same habitats, including this one. And those were captured, interestingly, under the Magnuson-Stevens Act reauthorization in 1996 by the creation of essential fish habitat, and under that doctrine, the designation of what are called habitat areas of a particular concern. Yes, and which are the highest tier of essential fish habitat. And SAV, I'm pretty sure all of it, habitat in North Carolina is already designated by the South Atlantic Council as under that highest tier. And the reason I mention that is that that brings with it an obligation by federal agencies to consider negative effects on these habitats too. And that includes not just the fishery management councils and the Department of Commerce that manages those that adopts those regulations, but all the rest of them, FERC and the Corps of Engineers and all the rest. So something that constitutes a negative impact there, if it is affected by a federal regulation, a permit, or an expenditure, it can be recaptured. And in fact, we can directly comment on those. And the Marine Fisheries Commission used to. I actually chaired a little thing that we call the Permits and Planning Subcommittee of this body when I sat on it back in the late 90s and aughts. where all of those proposed federal actions that would have this potential would be subject to action by the Marine Fisheries Commission that had that authority to comment under those federal programs. So I just, all I'm suggesting is that we have a broader leverage than we may think day to day, and should not be afraid to consider things that we might traditionally consider outside of purpose. So any further questions, and then we'll move on to the.
Yeah, right now, I met with Duke University 2 weeks ago for an innovative tech program they have for the undergrads. And they were talking about ways to propagate seagrass. And I kind of spoke ignorantly. I didn't know of anyone currently propagating seagrass for the purpose of restoration. Have you heard of anybody doing that?
Not in North Carolina. Further
Right, I
north.
know in like Florida, they're doing it, other areas.
Virginia has had a long running program that does eelgrass restoration via seeds. And up in Maryland, they've done some with seeds and with transplanted SAB. But in North Carolina, as far as I know, we are not doing any.
Is that something that we could work, given that
I
we're.
think Joel Fodry.
Actually, that's
Is-
Joel and Jesse Jarvis both have.
Okay, I was gonna say, they're at least working on it experimentally, I think.
Yeah.
Comment?
Yeah, and one of the hard parts of North Carolina, not to get too in the weeds, is the putting of anything that you've grown. It's not a seed, because seed kind of stands outside of a living organism. The way that the statutes put it, they built in an ability for marine aquaculture leases, but then made that impossible for us to actually do. And didn't give the commission any ability to further refine that. So as of right now, they even, they went to include seeding algae instead of marine plants, which would work for SAV, but in that case, it restricts SAV in that would require a marine aquaculture lease, but that's not something that we can feasibly create because the way the laws are, so that planting effort is then basically barred from being possible until that's a feasible route to then grant. So we're under this awkward situation with the laws, but because that doesn't function, any planting of a living seagrass organism would then be considered release of domestically raised organism, and therefore you would require a lease for that. So we're kind of under this issue where the only planting that could occur is seeds, while obviously being much more successful to grow seeds up into existing plants and plant it with a mat for right now. That's one thing.
You guys will bring us back some thoughts about that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I mean, we already have them written and they're ready for whenever the legislators ask us, so.
And Joel may be, I know he's harvesting seeds. I don't know what his plan, honestly, I don't even know what he's planning on doing with them. He may be just like spreading seeds, in which case it's completely legal.
That's.
I mean, very- I mean,
that's
that-
what the kids do it. They go on a boat, they go.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I know he's harvested millions and millions and millions of Zostra seeds this fall.
It's remarkably effective though, if you're in an area that supports it, like the VINs, people always show a slide where they wrote VINs in a seagrass bed with
With
seeds
seeds.
and
Oh,
it
okay.
grew into
Yeah.
it, so it can
Yeah.
work.
Just one wrinkle, again, we're thinking outside the box, right? And so one question is, well, maybe the word restoration is even just the wrong word, because what we're thinking about is not trying to get back to a previous state, because with sea level rise and other factors, including precipitation pattern changes, storm changes, we're actually moving forward towards some new state. And so that's figuring out not being constrained to put back something that used to be there, but the right thing for what should be there in the future, to me, may require some different way of thinking about what it is that we release where. And particularly if there are sedimentary changes that are profound in areas, or for that matter, development related changes that are profound, that might make us say, well, excuse my French, well, shit, we can't make that ever go back to what it was at one time. So let's just say in 1981. But if it's still within the ambit of SAB habitat and there's a different option, we need a mechanism to think about what the highest and best use of that habitat ecologically should be. And I think that's real outside our box. And so I think we need advice on thinking through what the prospects are likely to be and under climate change and other kinds of pervasive long-term change.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, don't be afraid to bring weird things. We'd love it. I would love it. Other questions before we move on to them?
Just a comment real quick. I looked it up because I remember I had a copy of it in my email, but you're with CRC?
No, sir, I'm a habitat management site.
So I thought they would point to you like you were CRC, but I know there's the CRC draft on sea level rise. And the numbers they have in there are 1 to 1.4 feet by 2050 with a pretty high level of confidence. So it's really only 25 years away. But a 1 foot of water rise that's a lot.
Yeah, the other thing, the joke of the deck for us here too is that most of, even the best LiDAR based models are going to get it wrong because of the dynamicism of the sedimentary environment. So at one point we had paid, well, it's not we anymore, Environmental Defense Fund had paid Stan Riggs and his team to do some, smoke and mirrors kind of modeling for what the sounds might look like under different, let's just say dynamicism regimes. And so, in that case, again, you blow a Roanoke Inlet or something to that scale in the system, you have larger scale cascade effects. You never know when that's going to happen. So how do you use that knowledge to tune or not your expectations for what you can or should grow in different places? I do think that the dynamic coastal environment is going to take maybe a different kind of thinking for what restoration or optimal conditions in the future mean. Great. So this is just the first bite at this, well, another first bite at this apple, and we'll be back to it. So thanks a ton for that. Can thank you, Ben.
Yeah, that's good. All right, so I'll try and move through this quickly because I'm sure y'all are hungry. We haven't had anything to eat yet. So what I'm going to do, talk to you all today, is 2 websites that I made for the Oyster Sanctuary program. And the purpose of these websites is to more or less make information about the sanctuary program more accessible to people of 2 different audiences. So the first is a story map, which I'll go through first, kind of give a background of what the sanctuary program is, benefits, and how sanctuaries are made. And then the second one is the data visualization app for someone who might be more analytically inclined, is a restoration, oyster restoration practitioner in another state or PI, for instance. So the Oyster Sanctuary program, this is the story map, is basically our attempt at subtidal oyster population restoration using artificial reefs. So in North Carolina, we now have 17 oyster sanctuaries, and that spans 788 acres of protected habitat in Pamlico Sound. So this program began in 1996, and so I'm lucky to be a part of it and help build the new sanctuaries that we got going on today. But an oyster sanctuary is protected habitat where harvest for shellfish, oysters, clams is prohibited. So we do this by using artificial reefs that we construct with alternative substrates rather than relying on oyster shell. We use aggregate rocks like concrete, marl, crushed concrete, limestone, marl, granite. But the reefs are anywhere between 10 to 80 acres in size. Actually, that's now, our largest sanctuary is going to be 126 acres in size. I have to update that. But obviously these are great areas for, protected habitat for fishes, invertebrates that rely on subtidal oyster populations or oyster reefs, which in Pamlico Sound have been depleted over the past 100 years. So a lot of people have been, like Dave Eggleston, Brandon Puckett, those guys have been doing a lot of research on the sanctuaries. And so they found that the implications of building these habitats have a profound impact on the rest of Pamlico Sound, despite the sanctuaries having a disproportionate or a relatively small footprint in Pamlico Sound. So the idea is that the sanctuaries are going to be protected areas for oysters to grow up to become broodstock, protected broodstock, that then feed larvae to the rest of Pamlico Sound. So one of the estimates that Eggleston and actually Jason Peters came up with was that 1 out of every 4 larvae in Pamlico Sound comes from an oyster sanctuary. So that oyster or that spat may settle on a natural reef, a culture reef, or another sanctuary, and then continue to grow. But obviously, oyster reefs provide economic importance as well. So the idea that these sanctuaries are providing some sort of fisheries benefit is also a pro to building these habitats. So they benefit the oyster fishery, they benefit finfish fisheries as well. And then there's the benefit of the habitat itself. So water filtration, there's a new estimate that a single oyster can filter up to 12.5 gallons in the day in the wild. That was updated from 50. 50 was like in perfect conditions. So that's more realistic number. So you can correct somebody next time they say 50, say it's not that good. But then they obviously these oyster reefs provide a lot more biodiversity, right? So the fishes, the invertebrates that live on these reefs, they all love surviving and or living in the interstitial space between the oysters and subtidal reefs in Pamlico Sound. Additionally, one of the other secondary objectives of sanctuaries is to provide recreational opportunities for the people of North Carolina. So recreational fishing, there's a lot of sheep's head, red drum that aggregate at these sanctuaries. Every time we go diving on there, we tend to see a lot of sheep's head. And we also see a lot of people fishing on the sanctuaries. So gives a little bit of an overview of what the construction process looks like when we build these sanctuaries. First, we start off with site selection. So we have a few parameters that we look at, environmental parameters that we plug into a habitat suitability index model. So the screenshot of that is here, where green areas would be a good spot to build the next oyster sanctuary. So that's been under development, put together through a collaborative effort with the Nature Conservancy, NC State, DMF, obviously. But that more or less guides where we're going to put new oyster sanctuaries. So once we decide where we're going to build them, then we have to stockpile all this material. This is our stockpile site down South River. Last year we had 43,000 tons of rock that came through, and that was used to build 40 acres of habitat, new sanctuaries. And this is what you'll see when we're doing deployments if you're out on the water. We load these barges up. This is all through a collaborative effort with the North Carolina Coastal Federation and Stevens Towing. This past year we had 50 days where we were doing deployments. So this barge is full of 800 tons of rock, and it's put down in 2 parallel ridges that are 200 feet long, 40 feet wide. So that creates the substrate that the oysters will eventually gravitate to and grow on. So once the rock is in the water, we do go and we scan it to get an idea of what the sanctuary looks like. So this is kind of a little fun, interactive way. So this is the blueprint of Cedar Island, and this is what it actually looks like after we built or deployed all that rock. So we get this through side scan, bathymetry data, but there's 130 some odd ridges at this 75-acre site, which is Cedar Island. And so you have an interactive map here where people can zoom in on each sanctuary, get an idea of what materials there are and how long they've been there. So West Bluff, you can take a look at all these polygons, hover over it, or you can see that this is marl. This is marl, and there's also reef balls at this site. So we also have a very extensive monitoring program, and this is going to segue into the data visualization app. But we have a very robust monitoring program compared to a lot of other states that are doing oyster restoration work. A lot of states, when they build an oyster reef, they may have funding for just 3 years of monitoring, post-construction monitoring. But since I've been here, we've had, well, I've only done 3 years of monitoring. But before that, we had a revamped monitoring program that has a full data set of every single sanctuary spanning back to 2019. So now we have 6 years of every single sanctuary, the demographic info, the density info of those sanctuaries. And actually, our monitoring efforts date back to 2007. And so there's slightly different protocols from 2007 to 2017. But I'm working with making sure that those are congruent. I just really want to put some time and thought into making sure that before I put the numbers out there, that it's all been done carefully and accurately. So our dive team is the apparatus for which we do our monitoring. We do this through scuba surveys. So in a given year, we'll dive on 150 plus randomly selected points throughout each of these sanctuaries. And so we'll go down, we've got our quadrats, and for some of the materials that we can dig up, we'll put a quarter square meter quadrat of material into a basket and bring it up to the surface. And what we do is we measure and count every single oyster. And so that gives us an idea of what the population looks like at each sanctuary. And then it also tells us about the different materials that we use, what's the best performing material. So I mentioned we use a bunch of different aggregate rocks, so granite, limestone, marl, crushed concrete, basalt, reef balls. So we have an idea of what the density is on all of these sanctuaries. But in a given year, we may count up to 20,000 oysters or more. So this is what that information looks like when we begin to visualize it. So here's just a histogram that gives demographic breakdown of the sanctuaries over time. So this is at Raccoon Island. And so what we're seeing is basically each of these lines is a bin for the age of the oyster via the left valve length. So over time, we start to see kind of a increase in overall density across all those different left valve lengths. And then we see a shift from the younger, smaller oysters to sublegal and then eventually to legal oysters. So then we start to think about how are the materials different? How are they performing differently? And so this is where the data visualization app comes in. So there's a little interactive graph right here in the story map, but there's a link to the data visualization tool. So I'll go into that here. So this gives
What's
also
the bottom access for, I didn't see a red.
oh yeah
On the slide before.
on
What's
this
the-
graph.
Yes,
So cooperate. This is material age, but this graph is also in the visualization app. So it's just kind of a snapshot of another website. So material age is on the x-axis here,
okay.
and oyster density is on the y-axis. So this is just kind of a bare bones version of this plot where you can zoom in on each of these dots, and each of these is
That's
central.
very interesting history of the program, if you look at what was being used through time, right?
Yeah, so historically, marl limestone was used in the very beginning with some shell that was used as well. But the oldest material that's out there, it's reaching almost 30 years of age, is marl. So the idea here is we're trying to visualize, what's the effectiveness of this material? What's the lifespan of a sanctuary? And so for some of our older sites, like at West Bay, this was a data point that was collected last year. Even though the material age is about 27 years old, we're still seeing a total density of 1,200 oysters. So that's very promising to know that, even long-term, there's sustained oyster densities. So each of these points is more or less a dive that we've done from 2019 to 2023. So I haven't done 2024 data yet. So the data visualization app, there's a little bit of overlap between this and the story map, but this is for people who might be working in other states in who might be working in oyster restoration, like in Virginia, South Carolina. And so I've shared both these tools with people at conferences that I've been to recently. They're really interested in what we're seeing. So this takes a minute to load, but basically shows you what we see when we're diving across Pamlico Sound. So here I've got a filter for 2023's data, and we're going to have a kind of a 3D map of Pamlico Sound. And you're going to be able to see all the different sanctuaries, and there's going to be a bar that represents the density of oysters at each of those. So zoom out, we got Pamlico Sound, and all the oyster sanctuaries are in bold here. But you could zoom in on Swan Island, and each of these bars demonstrates, there were this many oysters here. So it kind of puts it into scale, right? So 4,000 oysters, might not seem a lot, but compare that to Middle Bay over here, which has kind of struggled historically. At most, there were 240 oysters per square meter. So this graph was actually inspired by like a bike rental distribution in San Francisco.
Yeah.
So I wanted to put it together and just kind of like mess around with it. But that's how that came about. And so another way to, visualize the data, compare the data between sanctuaries, is through comparing those histograms. Zoom out a little bit. So this is the histogram, same kind of histogram that you saw animated in the story map, but it compares two different sanctuaries. So we have Swan Island and Crab Hole here. So Crab Hole that was built in 2003. Swan Island, this is a newer sanctuary. But this side-by-side comparison can break down what the overall density is for each of these sites, as well as legal density, sublegal density, and spat density as well. So at Swan Island, we have 2,500 oysters per square meter. Compare that to Crab Hole, which is about 20 years older. There's 936 oysters per square meter. There's filters here over on the side, so you can compare different years. So maybe that was just 1 year where it was higher. So the year before that, Swan Island had 1,200 oysters, so it doubled in densities from year to year. But you can also compare sanctuaries to themselves. So we'll go Swan Island from 2002 to 2023. So that's, one way to see the year-to-year difference. Another useful tool, at least for me, is to compare the same year, but there's a filter for different materials. So say I want to look at the difference between marl and granite, and I can mess with these filters in the sidebar. And now I have an idea of, okay, granite's holding 2,900 oysters per square meter versus 2,200 oysters per square meter. So that's one way to evaluate the performance of materials. And then the last page here is that graph that we were talking about with material age over time and total oyster density. So, the idea with these visualizations was to make it interactive, and that's what the filters do. But you can also zoom in on certain parts of the graph if you wanted to. So if you're only interested in what an oyster sanctuary does between years 2 and 12, you can just draw a box around it. Alternatively, this is for the y-axis here. The y-axis here is total oyster density per square meter. One of the other filters that I put in was for different size classes. So say you were only interested in market size or legal size oysters, since the purpose of the sanctuary program is to have brood stock, right? So you could filter all those sublegal and spat out, and then take a look at how the sanctuaries perform with respect to material age over time and the different materials. Alternatively, if you were interested in spat recruitment, you could just click on the spat button over here and see which materials are recruiting a little bit more. And there's another graph that does box and whiskers for material comparison. more or less the same thing, but it averages out the oyster densities across different materials.
Which one's best?
Granite's best. Granite and crushed concrete had statistically significant more oysters than all the other materials. But there's some caveats to that, right? Like marl, limestone, we have some places where that's nearly 30 years old. So we do know that material age does have an impact on how many oysters are in an area or on a material. So there's kind of a disproportionate age effect there for marl. So maybe I can incorporate, filtering out by year. But yeah, granite, short answer, granite's pretty good.
I'm amazed how fast you get legal size oysters on those materials.
Yeah, well, they're
I mean,
closed to harvest.
well, I know, even so.
Yeah.
If people were saying, put a bunch of rock out there, do they even work?
Yeah.
You get lots of oysters fast.
But that's more or less what I have for you all. So I'll take any questions if you have any questions.
Questions?
Our sponge.
Please.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry, you raised your hand. Go
Too
ahead.
Yeah, you raise your hand, you get.
many
first.
years in school. I guess.
Go ahead.
Why rock and the various kinds of rock instead of oyster shells? Is that because states such as South Carolina spend a lot of money replenishing their oyster beds with oyster shells that I think they're buying from the Gulf, and North Carolina doesn't want to spend that kind of money, or what's your thought?
Yeah. So oyster shell is definitely like the most coveted resource for oyster restoration. It's been like known that spat more or less recruit to that substrate readily in high densities. And because of that, it's, everybody's trying to buy it. All the states along the East Coast are trying to restore their oyster reefs from the Atlantic coast and the Gulf. So it's limited. People are buying it up quickly. But there's also logistic issues with shell recycling in general. So you have a whole bunch of, in North Carolina, for instance, in Raleigh, there's a bunch of seafood restaurants. The ability for them to get their shell over here, or for us to collect it and bring it over here, it's more or less a logistical nightmare for DMF to fund and to carry that out with our staff limitations. Now the Coastal Federation, they've worked with us with the sanctuaries. They are looking into kind of, finding a way to make that a little bit more either affordable or doable. But in the past, we have used oyster shell. At some of the sanctuaries, they've used oyster shell, clam shell, and at some of those sites, it actually didn't stick around. Those would have been West Bay and Deep Bay, and over time, that oyster shell kind of just was swept away. So it's not necessarily the most stable.
But is putting, if I can ask another question, that's all right, thousands of pounds of rock down on the seabed, might that be doing other things, possibly damaging that seabed that otherwise would have housed a different ecosystem now that it gets smuggled out of there?
Yeah. So when the sanctuary program first began, where they were selecting where to put sanctuaries, that was based on historical data of where oyster beds may have occurred historically. So they're building these sanctuaries where they knew oysters had been previously. So the impact there, I suppose, they thought it was a net positive for trying to restore where the oyster reefs were.
And if your data was showing 20 years history and then one that was relatively new, it didn't look very promising after 20 years. So does that mean long-term that we still have more to learn, which would be a polite way of saying that it's failing after 20 years?
So with the oyster recruitment that we're seeing here, anytime you put a substrate in any marine ecosystem, it's more or less like new free real estate, where everything's going to try and gravitate towards it and grow on it. So you're going to see an initial boom of oysters settling, but eventually you reach a carrying capacity, and that's where you start to see kind of a level off. And the longer the material is there at the bottom, it's more exposed to sedimentation, hurricanes, any other disturbance events. And that's going to further kind of push down perhaps the efficacy or the amount of oysters that can grow on a material. There are some caveats to this data. So perhaps some gaps in what did the sanctuaries look like? So the 30-year-old sanctuaries now, what did it look like 15 years into post-construction? So that's not necessarily depicted here in this graph. So that's something I'll be working on in the next year or so.
So you expect that it would be normal to be on the downside of the bell curve then?
Yeah, and that's what Jason Peters, Eggleston, Brandon Puckett, they also theorize that you're going to see these swings of reaching carrying capacity or exceeding carrying capacity and then going down and then leveling off a little bit. Because you can't have, it's not sustainable to have all those adult oysters competing with one another. Eventually, there's going to be predation. A lot of these numbers, like when we see oysters in the thousands, that's mostly sublegal oysters. So there's going to be some species competition there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Question?
I was wondering if sponges were a big deal in the marl and shell, or is that
Yeah.
story still hold up? I heard that story years and years ago, but
Yeah. So we do see boring sponge on a lot of the older sanctuaries, and that has been, those were constructed with marl.
With limestone.
So yeah, with limestone. So the association's there, right? Within the last 7-10 years, we've been experimenting with different alternative materials. Little Creek is one sanctuary where we used 6 different materials in one spot. Now that's also the deepest sanctuary, so perhaps it wasn't the best to test all those materials there when we were planning it out. But we haven't seen boring sponge there, and we're actually building a new sanctuary that's more in the open Pamlico Sound. That's called Brant Island. So right here, these 2 sanctuaries are our newest ones. Brant Island's 100 acres, Mott Point 126. And at Brant Island, because it's higher salinity, we're thinking that there might be a higher possibility of boring sponge. So we're using granite there because granite's a less porous substrate. So we're kind of testing it out. And yeah, it's a lot of learning as you go. But that, places further emphasis on continuous monitoring, right? So we can know what are the limitations, what are the impacts of different materials as we build throughout Pamlico Sound.
So Mark, if you would allow me, I'd extrapolate from your question to a different question, which has to do with where the program is headed. I asked you this before in the commission meeting in terms of goal setting for shellfish beds as key habitats that we might aspire to restore in the future. And so, more is better, in my view, at this point, given where we were. So the historical data ain't great, right? So you've got Winslow and those things from the 1880s that showed widespread oyster reefs. And I don't know what the intermediate survey data looks like, but it would be interesting to put this in your visualization into actually the answer you gave before, which is where they used to be, where they've been put back versus where they were. And I think we can begin thinking about what other approaches might be to supplement this, because my view is getting brood oysters out there now is really important, and looking at where oyster reefs might be able to be redeveloped under a different set of circumstances is a really interesting question at scale. And so, and again, if we're talking about not 1,000 acres or but 10,000 acres or 50,000 acres or 70,000 acres or something, but taking into account the other competing uses of the bottom and the interactions among those. You know, I don't know that we don't have a goal, do we?
Yeah, we don't have a number. Coastal Fed has a number, and that's 500 acres. And so we're gonna surpass that 500 acres of oyster habitat with Mod Point and Brant Island.
But that's a program number. It's not a chip number.
Right.
You know, a chip number, the way I helped write that law, and at the time that that law was written, what we hoped would happen is that for each and every one of these key habitat types, there would be not just a monitoring system to know how much we had, but against what our aspirational goals would be for each. So there would be a gain or a loss being tracked through time towards an aspirational goal. And then you could set up, you know, if you go and damage it, you compensate, you know, you 2 times or 4 times the loss. You know, you have no net loss, or rather net gain of each of these habitat types towards some aspirational goal. And so what I think we ought to be thinking about is, you know, I'm frankly, as an ecologist, I'm not that worried about putting that substrate down because the other habitats are in abundance right now. The unvegetated and unstructured sedimentary habitats are in abundance. Do you agree? Yeah.
Most of it.
Right. And so, but that doesn't answer the other question, which is what might we do to deal with that in between zones? Now that probably would require zoning, if you will, use zoning on the bottom along the way, but also maybe some science we don't have about perturbation regimes and, you know, what's possible in different places. I think you just go put oyster shell out all over the place now without all those oyster reefs that used to be there in place, they are going to probably get blown out and maybe sedimented from storms and maybe from shrimp trawling. I don't know. I mean, big, you know, industrial shrimp trawling. But there's a whole set of questions there that are really interesting.
Does the crushed concrete in a storm get spread out over an area that you wouldn't expect it to be?
I don't know.
The material, apart from shell, stays pretty much consistent. So we scan the reefs every 5 years to get an idea of, you know, is the material sinking, dispersing, just settling out, flattening out. And so, you know, again, I hate to kind of lean back on this answer, but our long-term data has been with marl. So we've seen marl kind of settling out in some of the older sites. I forget, there was something else I was looking at.
Do you remember what the natural reef acreage is now? I should remember. I can't remember.
I'm doing a hard review of Dan Bowling's work.
I mean, if you were guessing, what would you say it was compared to your 700?
70,000 square meters. More than that. Yeah, definitely more than that. Hundreds of thousands square meters. So again.
And the other question maybe for later is how that relates back to snapshots of the past. And in fact, I mean, I would actually, I don't know how you feel about it. Maybe you don't like it, but I would love to see Winslow's map up there somehow. If you,
yeah, I could definitely.
Or your version of what historic, let's make it parallel to SAB, what historical oyster reef habitat would look like geospatially.
Yeah, so I know that there's estimates that currently 5 to 15% of what should be there remains. So there's been
5 to 15.
Yeah, so there's been declines of subtidal oyster populations in Pamlico Sound up to 85 to 95%.
Great. Well, I thought this was fabulous. So other thoughts or questions? Sarah, and then we need to move to comment.
Quickly, you mentioned that a couple of the reefs were struggling. Have you determined why they may be having issues?
Yeah, so there's a few theories. So Middle Bay, that's this one up here. So that's had historically just relatively low densities of oysters. That's total legal. Part of that may be to low flow in the area. sedimentation. It's also the smallest sanctuary. So I think having, you know, an adequate amount of buffer space for all this material that we're putting down, I think that that might play a role in it as well. It's also not very high relief for the oysters too. So what's there now is mostly buried, and you may have like a foot of elevation or relief.
One of the other benefits you might choose to mention, if you agree with it, is that Peterson and his team, when he was still with us, had identified was the elevation itself, the relief, in terms of moving potential habitat out of potentially anoxic or hypoxic zones near the bottom. And that relief all by itself, vertical relief, creates a habitat value that oyster reefs and really very little else provides in those meso and oligohaline settings.
I'll have to go through, double check, make sure that's a point that's highlighted.
It's in the, I can't remember who Peterson, the student's name, the woman that did that. Anyway.
I know what figure.
Yeah, okay. Great. So, and if there are other questions, not to cut it off, on the agenda, we do have public comment scheduled for 7:40. I don't know if anybody present would like to offer a comment to the advisory committee, and then we'll make an offer if they're able. Are the people online able to comment?
You mean like public online?
Okay, they're
It
not.
has to be in person.
Okay, it has to be in person. So is there anyone who would like to make a comment to the panel?
I didn't sign up.
That's fine. Come sit and give us your name and for the record and make your comments, sir.
Jim Blackerby, I'm from Oriental,
Thanks, Mr. Blackberry. Appreciate you coming.
background in geoscience. Question about substrate. Do you vary the substrates within individual sanctuaries?
Sorry, what was that?
Do you vary the substrates, type of substrates within the individual sanctuaries?
Yeah, so some sanctuaries will build like one reef, like a ridge, with one material, and then if we have, like we did that for Cedar Island, we built with limestone marl. We also built with crushed concrete. At Brain Island, we have granite. We also had some crushed concrete from the year before, and so we used that. So there's different materials, and we try to. I would like to try and experiment with a few more to gain a little bit more insight.
Okay, thank you. And back to the SAV. Understanding what you have on the, say, on the west side of the sounds and in the western estuaries, do you have a little bit of feel, or are you making advances into understanding how much there is out there?
Yeah, so talking along like the mainland of the Pamlico Sound and Pamlico
Right.
servers. Unfortunately, our last statewide aerial survey that we got any good maps from that was 2007, 2008. And we haven't had a comprehensive survey of that area since then. In the meantime, there have been efforts to look at smaller bits of it and use a combination of divers with quadrats and following along in the boat with some side scan sonar to map that. But you can map a much smaller area with more detail. So there's been a little bit of that going on, but not really much in the way of getting some long-term surveys of the overall picture of that part of the estuary, unfortunately.
Did AvNet pay for that?
That was an AFNAP survey.
Okay, so we might think about, in fact, I'll be meeting with them in a couple of weeks. We could bring that up. Or have you already talked to, is there an intent? Is there an aspiration to
I'm
remap that?
sure that will come up. There's been discussion about we need to do more, and it's on the radar if we need to do a better job. of
Well, I mean, I can
monitoring
imagine
those
if
low
you're
slip
moving
the
towards
SAV.
a water quality standard for the oligohaline SAVs, that the map based on old data would probably not resonate. I would imagine in public comment that to that effect, so.
Right,
Really, yeah.
right. There's some desire to have some newer maps for sure.
Thank you.
Other comments, sir?
No, thanks.
Okay, is there anybody else here today that would like to comment? Hearing none, were there any questions that you didn't get to offer for either one of our speakers today? And if not, are there other issues that members would like to put on the table? Not for necessarily to be answered today, but for things to be considered in future meetings. Yes, Mark?
Yes, not to be answered today. I sent over to, Jesse and I spent some time, pardon me, on the phone today. Thank you for your time, Jesse.
Happy to talk.
3 links, having to do with, not what North Carolina Marine Fisheries has done with their salmon and their shrimp, but actually, some things that went on in Europe. And without even discussing it now, and I know time is of the essence, I sent 3 links to Jesse, and I understand he'll be getting it out to everyone. I'd like to make it part of this, of the record.
Yes, sir.
And Mark, I'll send those links out to everyone via email tomorrow, and they will be added to the meeting minutes from this meeting, so they're captured.
Thank you.
There's some pretty interesting things that are going on in Europe that are relevant to habitat more comprehensively. I was part of one in Scotland, looking at the birth of Clyde Sea, that was trying to cross match fisheries use patterns onto habitat values to try to look for fish gear and fisheries vulnerability relative to habitat value. And actually ran into an interesting buzzsaw related to marine protected area network design there, and some let's just say political questions that resulted, as you can imagine. But at that point, there was a lot of interest in trying to do some more synoptic, not just mapping, but also use mapping for large sound areas like, let's just say, Pamlico Sound. So if we were going to do that, one could imagine, an SAV habitat zone map that might be officially designated, a shellfish reef map that might be officially designated, in addition to the primary and secondary and special nursery area overlay, and others that might map on all of the different fishery management plans that are pertinent to that. Just while I'm dreaming, remember that this commission is actually not limited to adopt fishery management plans by species across the state, but by any combination of species, gear, and areas. And so one could imagine an overlay comprehensive fishery management plan for Pamlico Sound that would manage all habitat impinging gears. And I don't mean that to just seem like a threat, but in order to manage use conflicts and all kinds of other things like that at a scale. And we could do that down the road sometime once we understand where we're going. And so I do think that the SAV is like a great test case for thinking about what Pamlico Sound management ought to be. And I don't mean to limit it just to that place, because God knows Albemarle Sound in the future is going to be really complicated, as it probably doesn't stay oligohaline, but becomes saltier. So, how do you manage fisheries that don't even exist in a water body that is going to change profoundly from a much less salty place to a saltier place sometime? Anyway, sorry, but
Yeah, I mean, we are making, in the broader sense, life and death decisions for maybe the largest stakeholder that we really haven't discussed, and that stakeholder is a sentient animal of the shrimp. And they should have some sort of voice as well.
absolutely, no doubt. Law requires it, in fact.
I got one, different
Yeah,
topic.
sure.
Just for housekeeping purposes for our committee, one of the things that, because we do meet so infrequently, would it be possible to have the role of this committee, like available printed, it's a reminder to all of us and potential people that are going to join in, because as we saw for the last, they came to the shrimping, for example, our conversations very quickly deviated towards the humanitarian side of it, not necessarily towards habitat and water quality. We really took in consideration the human beings part of it. And I think at times we tend to wander that way away from the true purpose of the committee. So we just make sure that was.
I think all of that, just again, as a personal matter, I think all that's fine. And as long as we do our primary job, which is to provide ongoing advice to the commission on habitat and water quality issues. Jesse?
And on that note, Scott, like, we can absolutely provide, what the role of the Habitat and Water Quality Committee is, but you mentioned meeting so infrequently, and that was something that I did want to bring up, before we left tonight was, it's been a while. I think the last meeting was in January. That's almost an entire year. And just personally, that seems like too long to go between committee meetings for an advisory committee. And so I'm curious y'all's thoughts, like tonight, it was just a couple of informational presentations with no action items. Did y'all like this format for a meeting where we kind of just get together, talk and see a presentation, learn some stuff? And would y'all like to have more frequent meetings kind of this nature and not just when we have a scheduled action item?
Well,
Because if so, that's something we could definitely
so
do.
I understood it. Tell me, Sarah, if you're right, that this committee ought to be meeting 4 times a year. And in my view, that's at a minimum. And that's because the commission is moving forward regardless with on its schedule to adopt fishery management plans, each of which has a habitat section that identifies and relates to both fishing and non-fishing issues related to those habitats. And to be clear, for each of the life history stages of those species. And so those are coming just, right now. We have oyster, hard clam, fishery management plans moving forward, spotted sea trout, blue crab, a number of others that all have critical habitat questions. And I have felt like we get those as done deals too late in the process for thumbs up, thumbs down kind of treatment. And it would be better if we had more engagement with, and we're willing to put the time into engaging with earlier in the process. And these overlaps. I really think that we have an opportunity to take the SAB situation and turn it to our advantage in terms of looking at what the role of this committee is going forward. My advice. What do you think?
Thumbs up for that.
Okay, I think the answer, Jesse, is we would like to meet at least 4 times. I'll have a question for you. I was going to ask you anyway, and that is, back in the battle days, we actually met every month. Now the entire committee didn't meet every month, but we had a subcommittee that did meet every month, but because that was required in order to review permits that had a potential for important impacts on fish habitat, and we were routinely sieving through them every single month. And so that's sort of at the other end of the hands-on spectrum, and I don't expect that you will want to do anything like that. And I don't think the staff has the resources to support it. But we should be thinking about whether there are mechanisms that are allowable, especially under this new legal constraint, to engage any part of this committee in a less formal way to be more responsive to day-to-day input needs. Understanding that we would have to meet in an announced meeting to take a vote to give formal advice to anybody. At least I believe that's the case, right?
So if you're discussing official business, if there's in this case, 6 people present, it would be an official meeting of the public body and would require an official public notice. But that's
so what about a subcommittee of 3 people or 4 people that might agree to donate their time to a particular function? And I'm not suggesting one. I'm just trying to think if we can even think about this or not.
So it's really funny that you bring this up, Doug, because I think I talked to somebody about this either earlier today or yesterday, and I think it's a fantastic idea. And it's something that I want to talk with with both the MFC Council and the DMF Legal Counsel about, just to get their opinion on it also. But I do think, as I said earlier, the infrequency with which we've met, especially for this committee, but really the ACs in general, I think we would benefit greatly from meeting, whether it's as a group whole, maybe virtually if there's not any scheduled votes, if it's at a smaller subcommittee level, just a few of us. I think we could benefit greatly from that, just to, if for no other reason than to see each other more often and develop better relationships. And
Other people's thoughts. You heard mine. I think 4 times a year is a bare minimum together.
I agree. That sounds great.
I can share that I've served a couple times. This is my second round. First time was 6 years. In that 6 year span, I think we met maybe twice a year. Yeah, and I think in that 6 years, we maybe met one time where we actually gave guidance to MFC. And that was frustrating. So the fact that we had something earlier this year that was, it was a little contentious, right? But it was still, that's what we're here for. We're here to be consulted, and we want to provide feedback, or otherwise, why would you be here, right?
And just in addition to that, with the run up to the next chip, I don't think it can be too early for people who are donating their time to help make this as good as possible to have an impact. So,
And I'll share that I really appreciate the presentations today, because I'm not a marine biologist, marine scientist, I'm a meteorologist. So I've always been infatuated with how weather and climate impacts fisheries. It's incredibly interesting to me, but it's not something I can do in my career. So when I get to come here, this is like, it helps my brain. So I enjoy coming to this and learning. I don't know that we always have to meet if it's something that we don't have to vote on. Maybe we can do that more virtual. I don't have any problem with it, because if we're meeting here, I'm super close. But I think we do have some members that aren't that close, right? So maybe there's some sort of hybrid option where we're not voting.
So I think the
Make that
consensus
happen.
is to come back to us with a proposal of how the staff would like to use us, and don't be shy, is the way I hear it. But I think we would definitely like to count on meeting at least 4 times a year, and be available as we might be able to, should it be legal, to serve additional functions for the division and the commission.
well,
Related to Habitat Mark IV.
I think that sounds fantastic, and I'm incredibly grateful and appreciative to each one of you for showing up in person, and for those of you who joined online, who I think may have. I know.
Well, we're at time, and you're generous of that time, but so let's respect it and go ahead and adjourn this meeting tonight, but with my personal thanks, and I'm sure Sarah, for your time tonight. And thanks to the staff I thought the presentations were excellent.
And your next meeting is tentatively scheduled for January 15th.
Here.
Here, yes, sir.
I used to work for.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank y'all.
I'm gonna run if that's okay. 'cause
Yeah,
I got
that's-
3 hours.
So, yeah, I didn't hear about the.
I put some show on something. Yeah.
Yeah.